we've talked thus far about behaviorism, and now I want to conclude with some of the implications of all this for psychology and for understanding people, and then we're going to move into cognitive behavioral approaches. There are a number of implications of behaviorism, but particularly as Skinner developed it. One is that we could develop a psychology that's applicable to humans and animals, and that we can test rigorously with experimentation. And that is clearly one of the not only the implications but also the advantages of this approach. So the idea is there are laws of learning that are applicable to humans as well as to animals. A second implication is that we really don't need to look at consciousness. We don't need to look at wishes. We don't need to look at conscious beliefs. We don't need to look at mental life at all. The mind can essentially be treated as a black box, and all we need to do is to see that certain environmental events predict certain behavioral responses. That's all we need to know, and we can develop entire laws of learning and entire psychological theories and predict people's behavior and animals' behavior strictly on the basis of those two pieces of data. What happens in the environment? What does the person do? A third implication, if we get a little broader outside of psychology, is that there's probably no such thing as autonomy or freedom. From Skinner's perspective, our behaviors are always controlled. They are controlled by some contingencies of the environment, whether, for example, it's government, whether it's economics. I mean, if you choose to go into a particular profession, seems like a free choice, yet whether that choice is mandated by a government that tells you you will go into this field, or mandated by market forces that suggest there's no jobs in that other field, you are still essentially having your actions dictated by rewards and punishment. And the disconcerting aspect of Skinner's ideas about this is that we essentially don't really have freedom or autonomy. That's essentially a myth. It's essentially something that we imagine in our own minds, but really isn't the case. Now, the thing about Skinner that I have to say is that he took his assumptions, he ran with them, he tested them, and he was willing to think the unthinkable. I mean, who wants to think that there's no such thing as free will? And that's one of the things that you really had to admire about Skinner, who died fairly recently, as you all know, or as you may know. May he rest in his Skinner box. Sorry, I couldn't resist. We're now going to talk about cognitive behavioral approaches or cognitive social learning approaches, which developed out of the cognitive tradition, out of the behavioral tradition. The reason why cognitive behavioral approaches have really supplanted behavioral approaches by and large, most people who are therapists who come from what would have been a behavioral perspective now come from a cognitive behavioral perspective. The major reason for this, there are a couple of reasons. One of them is that some anomalies arose in the behaviorist literature. They did a number of experiments, and they started to find, for example, that animals could be learning even though they weren't being reinforced. There was a phenomenon discovered or studied in particular by a psychologist named Tolman as early as the 30s and 40s called latent learning. And what happened in latent learning is that he found that if you put rats in a maze and you let them just run around, and you put another set of rats in another maze, but you conditioned them by giving them some food at the end every time they ran the maze correctly, now, you would find that obviously the ones who were conditioned would get to the end faster. But the ones who had been in the maze the first time just running around doing whatever they wanted, emitting random operands, but weren't presumably learning anything, they weren't being conditioned. As soon as you put some food at the end, they ran that maze just as fast as the ones who'd been conditioned all along. Now, what that suggested was that they were forming cognitive maps in their minds of that maze. In other words, even while they weren't being conditioned, they were still learning. And that's something that was not well explained from the behaviorist perspective, because while they were not being reinforced, there's no learning that should have been occurring, yet in fact it was occurring. That was one reason why behaviorism as a field in itself has somewhat been folded into the more cognitive behavioral approach. Another is that simply times have changed in psychology so that a cognitive view is really dominant in psychology. Which the cognitive view owes its preeminence to a lot of factors, not the least of which is the development of computers, which gave people a new metaphor or way of thinking about the mind, as well as a way of modeling psychological processes that could be used to create new theories. And as the computer developed, so too did models of information processing, of human beings as information processing systems that take essentially input from outside, they somehow transform it in their minds, they somehow store it, they bring it back into some kind of workspace where they mess with it, and then they produce some kind of output. And that's probably the dominant metaphor that's used in psychology now. What cognitive behavioral or cognitive social theory has, it has a number of theoretical tenets, but I think you can probably say that there are two basic ideas to it. One is that mediating between stimuli and responses, or between things in the environment and ways that the organism behaves, or the person behaves, are thoughts, are cognitions. That's one of the basic ideas. The other is that in humans in particular, there's a great deal of social learning that goes on. Now, those seem like two very simple ideas, but as we'll see, they lead to a very complex theory that has also led to some important ways of treating psychological disorders, as well as understanding normal functioning and personality. In terms of, we'll start then with the issue of the role of cognition in human life and in human behavior and in mediating between stimulus and response. One of the first theorists who talked about this in particular was a man named Roeder. His name is spelled R-O-T-T-E-R, but for obvious reasons he calls himself Roeder instead. He developed a concept which he calls, that's probably not fair, he probably comes from Germany or something, that's where the name comes from, it's pronounced Roeder, but in any case, he calls himself Roeder, and so will we. He developed a concept called expectancies, which are basically what you think. They are essentially expectations. But his argument was that an animal will behave not on the basis of how it has been conditioned, but on essentially what it perceives, how it perceives it has been conditioned. That is, if an animal doesn't recognize a connection between a stimulus and some kind of behavior, or between its behavior and some kind of reinforcer or punishment, it will not behave on the basis of what looks like objective conditioning. What he was interested, a particular kind of expectancy that he was interested in was an expectancy that he called locus of control, or locus of control of reinforcement. That is, am I essentially in control of what happens to me, of the outcomes that happen to me, or are external forces in control of me? Do things outside of me control what I do? And he developed a questionnaire that was used for humans, not for rats, that tried to assess locus of control. And the questionnaire includes a number of forced choice items. By forced choice, I mean you have to say either A or B. Even though you think it's somewhere in between, you have to come down on which side you really believe. Here's some examples of his items. I more strongly believe that A, promotions are earned through hard work and persistence, or B, making a lot of money is largely a matter of getting the right breaks. Second one, in my experience, I have noticed that there's usually a direct connection between how hard I study and the grades I get. This is obviously for college students, versus many times the reactions of teachers seem haphazard to me. Another one, the number of divorces indicates that more and more people are not trying to make their marriages work, versus marriage is largely a gamble. Another one, when I am right, I can convince others, versus it is silly to think that one can really change another person's basic attitudes. Now, you can see what's happening is you come down either on the side that he calls an internal locus of control. You believe the causes of reinforcement or of effects that happen to you are internal to yourself. They are things inside you. Or, on the other hand, you can come down on the external side. You believe that what controls you is essentially outside of yourself. It is essentially external. Now, he developed ideas about other kinds of expectancies and not just locus of control. But basically, the idea behind expectancies is that we have generalized views of what happens, of what causes things to happen, of if I do this, what will happen, if I do that, what will happen, as well as some very specific expectancies. So we may not only believe that in general we control our fate, we may believe in a specific type of situation, even though in general we control our fate, we have a specific expectancy that in this situation I'm absolutely helpless and there's nothing that I can do. Now, this notion of expectancies was really developed interestingly by a person who was initially an animal researcher, or much of whose research was with animals, and his name is Martin Seligman, who was at the University of Pennsylvania. He developed a theory of depression called learned helplessness theory. And what he did, it became eventually a major cognitive theory of depression. What the theory says is this. He took dogs and he placed them on the bottom of a metal cage, and he electrified the bottom of the cage. Or there were other ways that people have tried this, but essentially the idea is you put the animal in a situation of uncontrollable aversive stimulation. There's nothing the dog can do to get out of this. Now, what he then did was he then created a situation in which they could escape by jumping out of the cage and over into another cage. What he found is what these dogs do when they're in this electrified cage and they can't get out is at first they're screaming and yelping and trying to get away. Before long, they sink to the bottom of the cage and whimper and essentially look depressed. If you measure them physiologically, they look like they're depressed in the same way that depressed humans look physiologically. They make a lot of the same kind of, they look very mopey. They look like they're down, they look helpless. If you then allow them to escape into this next cage, you change something so they could get away, what did he find? He finds that they don't jump over. That essentially they have learned helplessness. They have learned that there's absolutely nothing to do that can allow you to escape your state of misfortune. His analogy to humans was then, if you look at humans, they often sound very helpless. They'll say, there's nothing I can do, things are terrible, there's nothing I can do to change. They look physiologically like these dogs. And his argument then was that there was something similar about the way humans who are depressed have learned to be helpless. And that in turn exacerbates and creates further depression because they don't get themselves out of the situations that created their helplessness in the first place, or that could continue to create their depression in the future. Or they don't get themselves out of the situations that created their depression in the first place, or could help them get out of it in the future. Now, this theory was eventually elaborated into a more cognitive theory by Seligman and by a number of others, including my colleague at Michigan, Chris Peterson, into a concept of explanatory style. which essentially means your style of making sense of bad things that happen to you. People who have a depressive or pessimistic explanatory style tend to assume that when negative things happen to themselves, it is first of all their fault. They make an internal attribution. They say, in other words, it's internal. It's something about me. They think it's something that's global about them. It's not just that I didn't, say, do badly on the job that day because I'm not particularly good at that particular skill. I did badly that day because I'm just an awful incompetent. And they also believe that it's stable. They believe that it's something that is true of me that is going to last forever. So instead of saying, okay, that day I was supposed to sell a couple of extra things. I didn't get them sold. Why is that? Well, I'm not particularly good at sales. It's a good thing my job isn't in sales. Or, well, the people just weren't out there that day. They just weren't buying. That would be an external attribution. Instead, the person says, well, it's because I'm just a lousy worker, and everybody's going to know it now, and it's not going to change. I mean, there's sales involved in every part of my job, even though this person may be an engineer or whatever they are. There's sales involved in everything you do in human life, and it just goes to show that I'm just worthless. Now, you can see how you could interpret that situation all kinds of ways. You can explain it in all kinds of ways, but instead a person can choose to be more on the pessimistic side or more on the optimistic side. The interesting thing about this is that the way that we choose to interpret these kind of events not only has an influence on the way we behave, on the way we feel, it also appears to have an influence on our health. That people who have a more pessimistic explanatory style, who essentially have this more depressive explanatory style, according to some studies by Peterson and others, they appear to get sick more, as well as they have more depressed immune functioning, as well as they die younger. Then in a longitudinal study of people's attributional style or explanatory style, it's sometimes called attributional style, their explanatory style as measured when they were young can actually predict death rates later on. Now, it's not a perfect predictor. It doesn't mean if you're pessimistic, therefore you will die young. But it does mean that it is indeed an increased risk factor for dying young and for getting sick. It's because this pessimism essentially seems somehow to depress your system as well as your feelings. It also has numerous impacts on your behavior. I mean, if you think basically that you're an incompetent and the reason you didn't do well at something is because you're just incompetent or you'll never be good at it, it's going to impact on your ability to ever make an effort again. And you'll see in a moment that this leads to natural implications for treatment. How do you change a person's attributional or explanatory style? Now, another psychologist, Albert Bandura, argues that there's a particularly important category of expectancy, which he calls self-efficacy expectancies. That is, how much do you believe that you have the ability yourself to do something that you need to pull off? And his argument is that self-efficacy is a key expectancy in all of human behavior. If you're trying to change someone's behavior, for example, he did a study in which he had people who were afraid of snakes. So these are snake phobics. And he gave them all kinds of questionnaires assessing their beliefs about, for example, their abilities to handle snakes. Then he used a procedure called participant modeling, where what he does is, and we'll talk about modeling in a moment, but essentially what he does is he handles the snake in front of them. Gradually he gets them to handle the snake, and that's his way of treating the snake phobia. He finds that the best predictor of when they're going to be able to actually handle that snake is when they write down on that sheet of paper, I'm ready now to handle that snake, I know I can do it. So essentially, when the belief, the expectancy, the belief changes that you have the efficacy to do it, that is going to be a good predictor of when you're actually going to be able to carry out some kind of behavior. Now, the important point in all of this is that our beliefs and our constructs and the ways we see reality play a critical role in determining the way we behave. Now, notice the difference between that and the behaviorist point of view. The behaviorist point of view said, we don't care about what you think. What we care about is what happens in the environment and how do you respond. The cognitive social theorists say, no, there's something very important that mediates between those two things. That is, what do you believe about the environment? What do you believe about yourself? What do you believe about your abilities? And this also differs significantly from a psychoanalytic perspective, which would instead Bandura in particular argues, would suggest that you have to look at our motives. You have to look at why we want to do this. Bandura would say a much more important issue is how do we construe the situation? How do we understand it? Now, all of this dovetails with what happened in cognitive psychology over the last 20 years, 20, 30 years or so, which has been called the cognitive revolution, in which our ideas have really developed about how do we process information in our own heads. What these models, to give a sort of a simplified example of the way these models work, is they suggest we have several different systems in our brain, or systems in our mind, if you want to think more metaphorically, that mediate the way we think. That, for example, we have a short-term sensory registration, where information comes into our mind, we process it very briefly, we hold it. It's a short-term memory store. We hold it, if it's visual information, for about a half a second, and then it's right back out of our minds. And the way you can tell this is if you perform this experiment briefly, if you would, when I snap my hand, close your eyes, and I'll then ask you a question. Ready? Your eyes are getting heavy now. Okay. Did you notice that as you closed your eyes, for a flicker of an instant afterwards, you still had my image in your eyes? It's an example of sensory registration. You essentially keep a very, very brief registration or storage of that information that you've been seeing. And we know that this is true of other sensory modalities as well, particularly hearing. Now, there's another kind of relatively short-term store, which is called short-term memory, which holds information for about 30 seconds. And it holds information in mind in a particular way, which is that about 7 pieces of information can be held in mind at a time. And that there's a paper written by a psychologist named Miller that was called the magic number 7 plus or minus 2, because what he found is that people could typically hold about 7 pieces of information. Some people could hold 5, some people could hold 9. People vary, and sometimes they can hold 5, sometimes they can hold 9. Occasionally you'll hit 10 if you're really on. But by and large, you can hold about 7 pieces of information. I mean, that's why phone numbers are probably 7 digits, is because that's about how much you can hold. And if you have to come up with that extra digit, if AT&T added an 8th digit to phone numbers, we would probably be in a lot of trouble. Now that raises the question about why are we able to remember sometimes area codes? I mean, we can start, or if you have a familiar number, for example, at University of Michigan, 764 is the prefix to most of the numbers at the university. I can actually hold a couple of numbers in my mind if they both begin with 764, or I may be able to. Why is that? That seems to be relying on a lot of information. Well, the reason is that there's a process known as chunking. It's a very technical sounding term, but whereby you chunk information into chunks. You take information, you put it into chunks, you remember the chunk, and that becomes now 1 piece of information. And now you can store 6 more pieces of information on top of it. So I can, for example, remember that this number is 764 and another string of numbers, and I've still got a couple pieces of information left, essentially, in my short-term memory that I can keep. That's an example of chunking. And there were some fascinating studies done several years ago in the early 80s by some psychologists who trained an undergraduate. He was not someone who had exceptional memory, trained him to be able to keep about 80 numbers in mind in short-term memory at a time by this very complex procedure. If he was a runner, and they used his thinking in terms of running times, and he would organize them hierarchically in terms of this set of times and this set of times, and under that falls this set and this set. He was actually able to store about 80 pieces of information in mind at a time. Another way that we obviously keep information in mind is through rehearsal. That is, we rehearse it to ourselves over and over and over, because information falls out of short-term memory either if it eventually will fade after about 30, 45 seconds, or if you kick it out with some new information. So those are the 2 ways that information can get lost. So let's do a quick little experiment here. I want you to remember the following string of letters, and let's see how long your short-term memories are. Okay, ready? D, J, S, E, C, N, Y, S, E, W, S, J, A, M, E, X. Anyone remember them all or most of them? Now, let me tell you another thing. These numbers, I'm going to repeat these letters to you again, but let me tell you that they all have something to do with the financial world. D, J, S, E, C, N, Y, S, E, W, S, J, A, M, E, X. Someone want to give it a try? Yes. Okay, we've got NYSE, AMEX. What else do we have? DJ, Dow Jones. WSJ, Wall Street Journal. What else? SEC. Amex. Okay, you just covered it all. DJ, SEC, NYSE, WSJ, AMEX. You can see what happens is that you can remember a long string of those if you simply chunk them, and that's how chunking occurs. Now, there's another kind of memory store which is called long-term memory. And it used to be that psychologists would think of long-term memory as one system. But in fact, we're starting to find that it's probably more accurate to speak of short-term memory systems, sensory registration systems, you can tell I'm a clinician, as well as long-term memory systems. That is, we store information a variety of ways in our long-term memory, in part on the basis of different kind of representations. Like you may represent information visually. You may represent information auditorially. Auditorily? Through your ears. You may represent information through the sound. You may represent information through a taste or a touch. Or can any of you describe to me the smell of bacon? Okay, now you all have a representation of the smell of bacon. You would know bacon if you smelled it, but I'll bet none of you could give me a coherent verbal representation of bacon. That's because it's not stored that way. It's stored simply just through a, what's the word I'm looking for now? On your hips. It's stored on your hips. That's very good. It's stored strictly in an olfactory sort of way, as well as in a hippie sort of way. Those are examples of the ways we store things with different representations. In fact, I had asked you, if I asked you to remember a series of numbers, some of you would probably have visualized them, and some of you would probably have remembered them auditorily. Why is this word giving me trouble? Orally, thank you. Some would have tried to use an auditory mode of representation to represent them, or represent them orally. So what's essentially happening is there are differences among people in the way we represent things. I, for example, will rarely represent something visual because I have very little capacity to do that. I will represent things in words whenever I get the chance, because in terms of, if you were to come up with a couple of bell curves of different kinds of intelligence that marked where I am on a bell curve, in terms of visual spatial representation, I'm moving into the impaired range. I just cannot think in terms of maps very well. I'm just not good at it. If somebody gives me directions and say, "Hey, go this way, this way, this way, this way," wait a minute, names of streets, left, right, and I'll get that fine. You map me on verbal intelligence, and I'm way over here if you test it in a number of different kinds of ways. And so actually that gets to the point that's made by a psychologist named Howard Gardner, who's argued that we have multiple different kinds of intelligences, that there isn't just one intelligence that you can measure with a person's IQ, for example, but we have different kinds of intelligence that are typically mediated by different parts of the brain, have different representational systems, and you can be strong on musical intelligence, you could be strong on verbal intelligence, but you could be low on mathematical intelligence, you could be low on visual spatial intelligence, you could be awful at motoric intelligence or kinesthetic intelligence, the ability to move your body in adaptive ways, etc. So our information is stored in different kinds of representations. It is also stored in a variety of ways that psychologists have tried to study. One of them has been called schemas. Those are essentially organized thought patterns, and schemas the term has been used in an ambiguous way because it refers to a lot of different things. But to say that you have for example, if you were to say you have a schema of professors, what do you normally think of when you think of a professor? Absent-minded. Pipe. Tweed jacket that typically doesn't match his pants. What else do you think of when you think of professor? Glasses. Okay, you often think of old. Okay, many of you probably think of male.
Hopefully brilliant.
Hopefully brilliant. You obviously went to a very good school. Okay, what you're saying is most of you have some kind of schema of what a professor is. You have some kind of mental representation that's been built up over time through experiences with professors. It may have inaccuracies to it. For example, many of you may have been in school at a time in which all of your professors, the majority, were male. Or and that's an example in which your schema would probably need some revision because the times have changed, at least in some fields. But schemas can work in all kinds of interesting ways. Let me give you an example. This is from a study by Bransford and Johnson. I want to read you a few lines, a few sentences, and I want you in your mind, and those of you in video and audio land can do this for yourselves too. I want you to try to remember as much of this as possible so that you could repeat it back to me if I asked you for it. It goes like this. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. Got that? As you can most of you probably, your mind is in a fog right now, right? You can't remember too much of that. It sounds like a bunch of randomly connected ideas. Let's try it another way. I'm going to repeat it to you again, but I want to give you a label for this. And that is, this is called washing the clothes. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. As you can see, what has just happened is by activating your schema of washing clothes, you now have some way to understand this. So now these things mean something. The interesting thing about schemas and about memory is that we don't remember things typically by just forming an image of it, and we bring that image directly back when we're trying to remember. What typically happens is that memory is usually a reconstructive process and a constructive process, meaning we have lots of enduring schemas, lots of enduring ideas. What we do is when we learn something specific, we fit it in with a lot of those schemas. When we're trying to remember the episode, what we do is we activate the schemas and lots of little pieces of extra information that fit just with that particular incident, but we're using a lot of our schematic knowledge to fill in the gaps of things that we couldn't possibly have remembered from that circumstance. And that makes a huge difference when you're, for example, an eyewitness testimony in court. So that, for example, suppose someone asks you, suppose the prosecutor asks you the following question. At what speed did the cars smash into each other? Versus, at what speed did the cars hit each other? Now, by using the word smash, they can actually cue a particular schema and get you to estimate a higher rate of speed. And that's an example where the activation of schemas can really take you astray. And that's how schemas work. And we have schemas of all the kinds of people in our lives, as well as ourselves. And the self schema is something that has been researched by a number of researchers who are trying to get at the impact of that particular cognitive schema on our functioning in a number of ways. So the idea behind all of this, then, is that our behavior reflects the way we process information about ourselves, about other people, and about the world. I might mention that it's interesting to see how much convergence there has been in recent years between some psychoanalytic ideas and some cognitive behavioral ideas, because a number of cognitive behavioral theorists are stressing the way we represent ourselves in our minds, the way we represent other people in our minds, which is indeed the same thing that object relations theorists have been arguing for some time as well. Now, they have different ideas about how those representations work. They have differences in that cognitive behavioral people don't believe in defensive processes, and psychoanalytic people haven't done good experimental research on these kind of processes, but indeed there is some overlap in their conceptualizations. Now, let me give you an extended example of how a cognitive behavioral theorist would look at the generation of some behavior. What would lead you to produce a particular behavior? How would you follow through with it, etc.? And we'll see how this really gives you a fairly complicated picture. Though in some ways it's complicated and it involves a lot of steps. In other ways, you'll see that it really is a very simple and commonsensical way of thinking about where behavior comes from. Here's the scenario: your teenage son, who is a good student, typically, and who you've always had a good relationship with, is getting D's in school because he's not putting any effort anymore. Hopefully this won't be too close to home to too many of you. So your son is getting D's in school, and you've got to decide what to do. Now, where does your behavior come from? The first question that emerges is, how do you encode this situation? In computer language, encoding essentially means what kind of form do you put it in your mind? How do you, and now in this case, how are you going to construe it? What do you see it as? Do you see it as a failing on your part, in which case you may sort of get upset and flail your hands and say, I'm an awful parent, in which case you don't do anything? Do you see it as a deliberate affront to you by your son? He's trying to get me, in which case you may try to punish him, or you may try to confront him on it, or maybe you need to take your antipsychotic medications again. Do you see it as behavior on your son's part that needs to be changed? Do you see it as your son is doing something that's a problem for him, we got to work out some kind of solution? Let's suppose you conceptualize it that way. So you encode this as my son's problem that he needs work on. The next question is there some kind of goal or task that this is affecting? Suppose you now have the goal, I want my son to do well in school. So okay, you've encoded this as my son is doing badly at school, his problem. But I've got this goal, I want my son to be an achiever. What do I now do about it? Well, the next step is problem solving, which is something that's been described in the cognitive literature as well. You go about figuring out, now what would be the ways that could solve this problem to get my son now to pay attention and actually work in school? So you start going through a lot of ideas in your head. You think, well, I could punish him. Is that going to work? Hard to know. Depends on your son, depends on his history of reinforcement, depends on what kind of disciplinarian you are, depends on why he really isn't doing his work, depends on a whole number of factors. Suppose eventually you say, okay, I'm going to check his homework every night. Okay, so now you've come up with a plan. And what you've decided in this plan is you're going to check the homework each night for each of his classes, and you have a series of punishments ready in case he doesn't follow through and his homework isn't done. Okay, it seems like a reasonable plan. Next step, you have to have the requisite skills to pull this off. All the good intentions, all the good expectancies in the world, all the good goals in the world will not do anything for you if you don't have the skills to carry out the required behavior. So in this case, are you a disciplinarian? Are you able to follow through when your son does not do what he's asked and to punish him even when he says, but Ma, the Three Stooges are on now, or, I want to go out with my friends, or do you have the competence to understand whether he's done his homework seriously? I mean, for years I went through Latin in high school by writing out, if it said agricola, I'd put agriculture or something like that. I wasn't paying any attention. My teacher would check to see that I had written a translation, so I didn't care. Veni, vini, vici. It's like I knew part of it. I came, I saw, and then I was victorious or something, which was close, but I was just, making up random things that sounded close enough so when she looked at the paper it looked accurate. So do you know your kid's assignments well enough to even know that this kid is really doing the homework and paying some attention to it? Okay, suppose you have the skills. Suppose this is your plan. Now a lot depends as well on what are called behavior outcome expectancies. Do you believe that this particular behavior on your part will produce the desired outcome? If you don't believe that, you're not going to carry through the behavior. Do you really think that checking your son's homework is going to make him get better grades and do better on his exams in class? Maybe, maybe not. Beyond that, you now have to have a self-efficacy expectancy. You have to have the expectancy that you can pull this all off. Suppose you do have the skills. You are a good disciplinarian. You know advanced algebra. You know how to solve his physics equations, so you know whether he's making a real effort. You know Latin, okay, and your son's taking all of these classes. So you have all the skills, but suppose you don't believe that you're able to do this. Suppose you just think, I'm just not very good at discipline. Or suppose you think, I can't possibly understand all these complicated things that he's doing. I took these classes so many years ago when I was in school. I wouldn't know I wouldn't know how to solve a geometrical problem. I wouldn't even know if he's making a good stab at it. If that's the case, your behavior will be derailed. You're not going to try this because you don't believe that you can pull it off. On top of that, then, a final step is self-regulation. That is, you have to monitor your progress in this behavior. That is, you have to check to make sure that you're actually following through and doing what you're supposed to do. If you're not doing it, you've got to come up with some kind of new plan. If your son is not following through in the way that you're expecting him to follow through, you then have to figure out some kind of solution, and you have to do new problem solving and then monitor that problem solving. Now, when you think about this example, a simple situation, your son is not doing well in class because he's not trying very hard. Look at all the steps in which this could get derailed. And now, on top of that, you've got all the steps in your son's set of variables affecting your son's willingness to actually do these things, all of which, at any of those steps, if one of these things doesn't work, the behavior is derailed. It's indeed amazing that any of us do anything in our lives, given how much it takes to actually pull some of these things off. So the first point, then, of cognitive social theories or of cognitive behavioral theories is the idea that cognition plays a very, very important role in mediating our behavior and determining what we do. The second major point of these theories is the role of social learning. That is, that we are social creatures. We are constantly being reinforced by others. We are constantly reinforcing others. We're constantly being punished by others. We're constantly punishing others. Again, some of us more than others. And what happens is that our behavior is going to be determined to a great extent not only by those processes, but also, as Bandura and others have argued, by our simply observing other people behaving in various kind of ways. That we're not always being reinforced in our behavior. We can learn all kinds of things simply by watching other people, and that's what this approach focuses on. One major aspect of this theory is the idea that our behaviors are tailored to situations. That situations pull from us different kinds of behaviors, and it's not just that we have, Walter Mischel, who's one of the major people who has espoused this point of view. He says we don't have broad personality dispositions, or this was his initial argument. We don't have broad personality dispositions. He'd say, those analysts are saying this guy's an anal character. He's messy, and or let's take the other kind of anal character. He makes lists all the time, and everything's got to be in order. He gets really upset if there's one glass in the sink, etc., etc., etc. This shows up all over the place. They would say, wait a minute, that's not the case at all. People learn specific behaviors. If you want to change their behaviors, you change the specific behaviors. If you want to see why they behave in a specific situation, look at what that situation demands. Because someone who's neat and orderly in one situation may not be neat and orderly in another situation. And one of the most powerful examples of this was a study done by a social psychologist, Phil Zimbardo, who was creating an experiment that he could not finish because he wanted to see the impact of roles that people play on their behavior. So he took a bunch of Stanford undergraduates, and for a week they were going to carry out this experiment in which some of them were prisoners and some of them were guards. And they really did this in an elaborate way where the police came and picked up the prisoners. And they really did this right, and they wanted to make it very much like a prison guard experience. The remarkable thing was they had to discontinue the experiment because people were so drawn in by those roles that they started behaving like sadistic prison guards, or they started behaving like weak, intimidated prisoners. People had the prisoners and the guards, but especially the prisoners, had so much distress generated by this that Zimbardo had to call it off. In fact, he noticed in himself his own reactions on all of this, the way he started to act like a guard himself. And he was aghast by his own reactions. But what it really spoke to was the power of situations in pulling from us things that we never would have dreamed that we would be capable of. So what Mischel and others have argued then is that our behaviors are tailored to situations. And they would argue against psychoanalysis that we don't have these broad personality traits, but rather we have specific behaviors that are going to be drawn in specific situations. Another major aspect of social learning theory, or cognitive social theories, has been developed by Bandura in particular, and that's the notion of observational learning. Whereas the behaviorists say that we learn by trial and error. That is, we learn by things happen, we do something, something happens in response, we like it or we don't like it. Well, I'm sorry, Skinner wouldn't say that, but it's either aversive or it's reinforcing, and therefore we do it or we don't do it again. What Bandura suggests is that we learn a great deal by simply watching other people behave. One of his major concepts is a concept called modeling, where essentially you see a model perform some kind of behavior, and through watching that behavior, you develop the competence to perform that behavior yourself. You may, in fact, even develop the motivation to perform that behavior yourself, which is sometimes called vicarious conditioning. That is, you watch somebody get rewarded for something, and you say, oh, you get rewarded for this, I guess I'll do that too. A couple of examples of that. The research that Bandura has done, some of it used what he called Bobo dolls, and this is this big doll that you can play with in all kinds of ways. You can be nice to Bobo, or you can be not so nice to Bobo. And what he did was he had little kids watch somebody interact with Bobo. And in one condition, they acted in a nice, sweet sort of way with Bobo. In another condition, they kind of ignored Bobo. They did this in different kinds of tests over time. But in the other condition, they behaved aggressively with Bobo. They punched Bobo. They slammed Bobo against the ground. They jumped on Bobo, etc. What he observed then was the way these children would act in turn with Bobo themselves when given a chance. What he did indeed find was that there was a significant relationship between what they had observed and the way they behaved. If they saw somebody mistreating Bobo, they were likely to mistreat Bobo themselves. And the obvious implication of this is that children learn a great deal by modeling what they see. And again, this speaks to why it can often be counterproductive to use physical punishment to train children, particularly any kind of severe physical punishment, which usually comes out of the needs of the parents rather than out of any child training needs of the child. But to use physical punishment, and severe physical punishment in particular, you may be teaching aggression because the child is learning to do what the parent does, which is to punish people with severe physical aggression. Bandura actually tells a joke about a farmer who was trying to teach a pigeon to say uncle. And he tried this over and over and over again. The pigeon was not learning. He tried even using appropriate behavioral procedures, which was when the pigeon produced the wrong response, he used a stick and swatted the pigeon. That didn't work. So eventually he just gave up, and he just said, I'm done with this pigeon. He takes the pigeon, he dumps it off in the chicken coop, and he says, forget this pigeon. Well, a while later he notices that there's a commotion going on in the chicken coop. Goes in there and he looks inside, and what's happened? Here's this pigeon brandishing a stick over chickens, going, say uncle, say uncle. Another example of well, I guess you could say where are the laws of learning when you need them. In modeling, then, you can learn a competence. You can learn to produce some kind of behavior, even though you don't produce it. For example, I may have learned from television or from watching Silence of the Lambs or whatever. I may have learned ways of killing people. That doesn't mean I'm going to go out and kill people. I may have developed a competence to do it, but that's not a competence that I intend to exercise. On the other hand, you may actually learn motivation, or you may learn how people are rewarded or punished for various kinds of behaviors by seeing them do it. I mean, you see somebody get away with something else, you may try that. You see somebody get punished for something else, you may not try that again because you're vicariously learning from their experience. Actually, another kind of amusing study of this that was done many years ago it was young children who were observing this, and there was an older model named, I think they called him Rocky. This was all before the Rocky films. This was not done by Sly Stallone before he became famous. But this older model named Rocky, adult model named Rocky, goes in. He's interacting with this other model named man in the study named Johnny or something. Goes over and takes a bunch of things from Johnny aggressively, dumps him in a sack, and walks off with a sack over his back, singing "Hi ho, it's off to play I go." Okay, that's one condition. Another condition, he doesn't do this to Johnny, and they play amicably. What happens then is they want to see the aggressive behavior of these children. They want to see, will the children behave more aggressively toward their peers after watching this kind of behavior rewarded? Because essentially he gets away with it. In the other condition, he tries the same thing. Let me get the condition right. In the second condition, he tries the same kind of thing where he tries to take these toys, and Johnny prevents him from doing it, and he gets punished for it. So Johnny essentially does the punishment himself, as I remember it. So here are these two conditions. So you're learning either this kind of behavior is reinforced or this kind of behavior is punished. Interestingly, the kids were in fact influenced by it. They tended to do something close to the side of what they'd just seen. If they saw aggressive behavior rewarded, they were likely to say, aha, aggressive behavior can be rewarded here. The interesting thing about it was these kids had already learned some rules of right and wrong, and they were quite ambivalent about being aggressive. One little girl, for example, made a comment. I think these were preschool kids, but she made a comment that what he was doing was wrong, and that she didn't like what Rocky did. And then she says to the experimenter, "Do you have a sack?" So in any case, that's what modeling is all about. Now, how does all of this apply to psychotherapy and to treatment? There are a number of different ways that you can use and to psychopathology. How does this all apply to psychopathology and to treatment? There are a number of ways that you can use these different kind of procedures in treating people psychologically. Let's start out with some of the behavioral ways, because you can use some straightforward behavioral methods of really helping people with a number of problems. I should again tell you, as I'm describing this, that though I've told you before that I'm certainly more of a psychoanalytically oriented practitioner, I have certainly at times in various treatments used some of these things, because I think in certain cases they are much more effective, and I think in certain cases you're going to do much better for your patients to work with some kind of combination of the treatment. There are dangers of that. There's a danger of taking sort of a Chinese menu approach to psychotherapy, where you take a little from list A and you take a little from list B. Because to give an example, suppose you're working from a psychodynamic perspective, and you try doing some kind of concrete behavioral treatment where you are telling the patient essentially, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. Well, suppose this is a patient who has a lot of issues around authority. What are you going to do to the relationship between you and your patient in doing that? So there are plenty of times when this can be a problem, unless you're then in turn willing to look at the relationship between the two of you, how it's being affected by it, etc. But so you have to be careful in the way you integrate these treatments. In terms of behavioral strategies, the idea behind behavioral methods of behavior modification is that maladaptive behaviors are relatively specific, and they are learned, and therefore that if you want to change maladaptive behaviors, what you do is essentially create a new series of contingencies of reinforcement. You essentially come up with a new way, a new environment for this person. You change the environment that controls the person's behavior, and therefore you can control the behavior. And the idea is that aspects of our personality, shyness, manipulativeness, inhibition, tendency to talk in particular ways or to act in particular ways, that these things are all essentially learned behaviors, and that you don't have to start worrying about ids and superegos and egos and compromise formations to change a person's behavior. What you need to do is to focus on that specific behavior that's the problem and change essentially the environmental contingencies that control that behavior. So, for example, with let's take the case of well, I guess let's start with the case of something that's fairly specific involving classical conditioning. Suppose the problem is someone comes in and they have a phobia, and you say, the person, say, has a dog phobia. They're afraid of dogs, and you want to help them get through it. How do you do this from a classical conditioning perspective? There are a couple of major ways that are used, 2 or 3 major ways. One of them is called systematic desensitization. The idea is that what you've got is a stimulus, dogs, that is inappropriately causing some kind of response, emotional response, which is that you're getting anxious. So what do you want to do? You want to break that connection. Well, how do you do that? In systematic desensitization, what you do is you have the person imagine. You first have them come up with a hierarchy from the most scary, or from the least scary to the most scary. So you say, okay, what's a scene with dogs you wouldn't be too afraid of? Say, well, I don't know, seeing a dog 100 yards away on a leash when it's a dachshund. That doesn't bother me too much. Okay, good. Now give me some in between, and you get closer and closer, and finally you say, what's the scene that really scares you the most? Petting a big German shepherd. Okay, so there you now have a hierarchy of things from the least feared to the most feared. Now you teach a person some kind of training, like relaxation training, where you teach them. There are ways to do this. For example, you can train them to tense up different muscle groups. Like you have them tense up this for 5 seconds, release. Tense up for 5 seconds, release. You do this across all the muscle groups that you can get at in their body, and by that time they're in a fairly deep state of relaxation. You can do it in all kinds of other ways. You can have them imagine a relaxing scene at the beach or listening to the waves. I mean, this is not good if you've got a person who's ocean phobic, but you can tailor this to people in ways that will make sense for them, so that you'll actually relax them. Then what you do is you have them now start to imagine the things that they're scared of, but starting at the least scary end of the hierarchy. And you say, okay, I want you now to imagine that scene of the dachshund 100 yards away, leashed. Do you imagine that? Yes. How are you feeling? I'm getting a little bit anxious. Okay, now I want you to do some of the relaxation training. So you get them to relax again. You say, how are you feeling? Keep that in mind. How are you feeling? Feeling fine now. Okay. Now I want you to go to the next one. Now you've got a let's say a basset hound that's 50 yards away on a leash. How are you feeling? I'm getting a little anxious. Well, you can see the principles. You then relax them again. You get them closer and closer and closer to the thing that they are actually most frightened of, and gradually you will be able to desensitize them to that feeling. You'll be able to make them less and less anxious under that circumstance. And that's the principle of desensitization. Now, there's a very different procedure that can be used, which in some ways you would think would be a very frightening procedure, and is really, in many respects, it looks like the opposite of systematic desensitization, even though it also draws on classical conditioning principles. And that's called in vivo exposure. I'll expose you to that at the beginning of the next lecture. We'll now stop, and then we'll complete our talk about cognitive social learning theory in that lecture.